Page 3. Truth and Reality, Otto Rank, 1936. 1.2 The projection of what has been learned. The main task, however, as indicated in Genetische Psychologie, continues to be the presentation of the chief actor and at the same time chief onlooker, the individual ego, in this, his dual role. This involves not only the duality of actor and self-observer, but has yet another meaning, in that, for civilized man, the milieu is no longer the natural reality, the opposing force of an external world, but an artistic reality, created by himself, which we, in its outer as in its inner aspects, designate as civilization. In this sense, civilized man, even if he fights the outside world, is no longer opposed to a natural enemy but at bottom to himself, to his own creation, as he finds himself mirrored, particularly in manners and customs, morality and conventions, social and cultural institutions. The phenomenon thus described is of fundamental meaning for the understanding of the human being's relation to the outer world as well as to his fellow man. For while Freud's reality psychology emphasized essentially the influence of outer factors, of the milieu, upon the development of the individual and the formation of his character, even in Der Künstler I opposed to this biological principle, the spiritual principle which alone is meaningful in the development of the essentially human. This is based essentially on the conception that the inner world, taken in from the outside by means of identification, has become in the course of time an independent power, which in its turn by way of projection, so influences and seeks to alter the external, that its correspondence to the inner is even more close. This relation to outer reality I designate as creation in contrast to adaptation and comprehend as will phenomena. The indication of its psychological determinants and dynamic factors in terms of this will psychology, forms the main content of the following chapters. This conception of the influencing and transforming of the milieu by the individual allows for the inclusion of the creative, the artist type, for whom there is no place in Freud's world picture where all individual expressions are explained as reactions to social influences or as biological instincts and therewith are reduced to something outside the individual. For with Freud the individual in the nucleus of his being, the so-called id, is subject to the great natural laws, under the guise of the repetition compulsion, while personality consists of the layers of identifications which form the basis of the parental superego. 3. This perhaps may account for the great mass, the average, although even here it can be true only roughly, but it can never explain the creative type nor the so-called neurotic, who represents the artist's miscarried counterpart. In this cursory survey I should like to characterize the creative type, in a preliminary way only, in this regard, that he is able, in a way soon to be described more closely, to create voluntarily from the impulsive elements and moreover to develop his standards beyond the identifications of the superego morality to an ideal formation which consciously guides and rules this creative will in terms of the personality. The essential point in this process is the fact that he evolves his ego ideal from himself, not merely on the ground of given but also of self-chosen factors which he strives after consciously. As a result, the ego, instead of being caught between the two powerful forces of fate, the inner id and the externally derived superego, develops and expresses itself creatively. The Freudian ego, driven by the libidinal and restrained by parental morality, becomes almost a non-entity, a helpless tool for which there remains no autonomous function, certainly not willing whether this be creative or only a simple goal-conscious striving. In my view, the ego is much more than a mere show place for the standing conflict between two great forces. Not only is the individual ego naturally the carrier of higher goals, even when they are built on external identifications, it is also the temporal representative of the cosmic primal force, no matter whether one calls it sexuality, libido, or id. The ego accordingly is strong just in the degree to which it is the representative of this primal force, and the strength of this force represented in the individual we call the will. This will becomes creative, when it carries itself on through the ego into the superego, and there leads to ideal formations of its own, which, if you will, in the last analysis arise from the id, at all events not from without. On this account, the creative man of every type has a much stronger ego than the average man, as we see not only in genius but also in the neurotic, whose convulsed hypertrophied ego is just what creates the neurosis, psychologically a creative achievement just as much as any other. 4. The creative type, whose denial we see in the inferior neurotic, is therefore not only characterized by a stronger impulse life, but also by a wholly special utilization of it, the most important aspect of which I consider the ideal formation from the own self, i.e., on the basis of the own impulsive makeup, whose negative we have to recognize in the neurotic symptom formation. However, while the neurotic so strengthens his repressions against his stronger than average impulsive self, that they finally make him completely incapable of willing and acting, in the creative man there occurs a qualitatively different impulse displacement, which manifests itself psychologically as ideal formation with simultaneous expression in conscious creative activity of will. Such a conception makes creative power and creative accomplishment comprehensible for the first time, rather than the insipid and impotent concept of sublimation, which prolongs a shadowy existence in psychoanalysis. From this viewpoint one could say that with human beings sometimes even impulsive expressions are only a weaker, less satisfactory substitute for that which the creative power of will would like. Therefore, as it were, not only the fantasy-produced substitute for unattained reality, but even the reality which is attainable, is only a weaker substitute for the inexhaustible willing. The psychological understanding of the creative type and of its miscarriage in the neurotic, teaches us therefore to value the ego, not only as a wrestling ground of id, impulses and superego, repressions, but also as conscious bearer of a striving force, that is, as the autonomous representative of the will and ethical obligation in terms of a self-constituted ideal. Freud's original wish-fulfillment theory lay much nearer to this recognition than his later doctrine of instincts, which actually only represented a biologizing of the unconscious wishes. We easily recognize in the Freudian wish the old will of the academic psychologists, although in the romantic guise of natural philosophy, while the wish, as I first explained it in Der Künstler, actually corresponds to an impulse tendency which later was ascribed to the supra-individual id. But the conscious wish-fulfillment tendency of the ego, for the designation of which the suitable word will exists, extends, as Freud himself finally had to perceive in the ego and id, much further than he was willing to admit, while the instinctual impulse tendency in men is less extensive than he originally thought, since it is repressed by the powerful superego factors for Freud and, for me, in addition, is molded by the self-created ideal formation. Page 5.